George Washington, you know, at the Constitutional Convention, he had some hesitancy to be there, but he was strongly encouraged to go, so we went. Keep something in mind. If the Americans had lost, and they could have lost very, very easily, especially without the help of the French, every one of these men would have been tortured and hanged, starting with George Washington. You know what happened in 1732 on February 22nd, the anniversary being yesterday? George Washington was born. You know what happened last year on February 22nd? My son Chase and his lovely bride got married, Taylor, and so we keep that in mind. But George Washington, the greatest president we ever had, in my view, followed by Lincoln, and probably followed by Reagan, who defeated the Soviet Union. And so George Washington, of course, is under attack all the time by the people who hate America and yet profit from it. But I thought it would be worthwhile to take a little look at a very short clip of a documentary involving George Washington from Mount Vernon. If you've never been to Mount Vernon, it's in Alexandria, Virginia. It is fantastic. And it hasn't gone woke yet. The left has not taken over the board there. It's in the hands of a private trust, and they do a hell of a job there. So if you're going to go visit, I would visit soon. I donated a document to them several years ago. That property belonged to George Washington's aunt, and he leased it from her until her passing, in which case he received it as his property. But it was the last lease that George Washington signed on Mount Vernon when he was a lieutenant colonel. I believe the date was 1760. And you can see what he was paying and what he would be giving to his aunt, growing on the property there, the number of slaves he had. I think there were 4 or 5 slaves, something to that effect. And I donated it to Mount Vernon. Now, Mount Vernon showed it for about 6 months, and they stuck it in its vault with its most prized papers. And I said, you know, I have a vault too. I can stick it in my vault. But it's available to researchers and so forth, and I'm told from time to time they'll show it. I certainly hope so. That's the goal. So let's take a look at this in honor of George Washington. Yes, the father of the country. Go.
Washington crossing the Delaware. A painting by Emanuel Leutze hangs at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. This painting is perhaps one of the most recognized in American history. But few know the whole story of this treacherous crossing of the icy Delaware River, the terrible battles that followed. Amidst the darkest hours of the Revolution, General George Washington led a ragtag force against one of the mightiest militaries in the world. The American effort would stun the world and revitalize the Patriots' cause. Washington's plan is risky. On Christmas night, in the dead of winter, his army would cross the Delaware River at 3 points and trap the Hessians at Trenton. Washington, with 2,400 soldiers and much of the artillery, would march to Trenton for the main attack. James Ewing's brigade of 800 Pennsylvania militiamen would seize the bridges across Assunpink Creek, and Colonel John Cadwallader's 1,200 Philadelphia Associators and 600 Continentals would distract the Hessian Grenadiers and Scottish Highlanders stationed at Burlington. But this grand design began to unravel almost as soon as it started. Huge chunks of ice made the Delaware almost impassable. Ewing's troops at Trenton Ferry and Cadwallader's force further south both failed to cross the river. Washington's main strike force fared little better, moving slowly as the light rain gave way to driving hail and snow. 2,400 men, as well as horses, and 18 pieces of field artillery, each gun weighing around 2,000 pounds, needed to be ferried across the icy river. Washington himself crossed first and watched the rest of his army struggle to follow. When they all finally reached the New Jersey side of the river at 3 a.m., they were a full 3 hours behind his carefully choreographed plan. Washington brooded over the delay. With his entire army at risk, should he turn back?
As I was certain there was no making a retreat without being discovered and harassed on repassing the river, I determined to push on at all events.
With the icy river behind them, turning back was not an option. Despite the delays, Washington and his generals decide to follow the original plan. Washington's column approaches Trenton, 2 wings. Defending Trenton were 3 battle-hardened Hessian regiments, 1,500 men, under the command of Colonel Johann Gottlieb Rahl. Contrary to legend, they were not drunk or even drinking. Instead, they were on high alert. Hessian pickets guard the approaches to Trenton. Those not on duty sleep in battle dress, loaded muskets within reach. Despite the preparations, Rahl's men are caught by surprise. Erroneously believing Washington has the town encircled, but considering the Americans poor soldiers, Rahl orders his men to counterattack. Knox's field guns and American musket fire shatter their brave charge. Rallying his men for one last frontal assault, Rahl is shot twice in the side. He'll die later that night. When the remaining Hessians attempt to retreat, their only route of escape is cut off by General Sullivan's arriving column. Though some Hessians make it out, Washington's men capture almost 900 and inflict 100 casualties. As the captured arms, equipment, cannon, and gunpowder is tallied, Washington is forced to confront his own losses. Despite suffering many wounded and others incapacitated by the severe weather, he reports on several killed, men who froze to death in the unforgiving cold. But more valuable than guns or ammunition was the victory itself. Though his attack was behind schedule, his conditions, fraught with rain, snow, sleet, and his enemy was at the ready, General Washington had shocked the greatest empire of the day.
And that's one of the earliest victories and one of the few victories that the Americans had over the British, the Hessians, being Germans. And that war went on for over 8 years, the Revolutionary War. Some might today call it a never-ending war. And also, in order to win that war, we had the help, particularly near the end of the French. The French Navy at Yorktown bombarded the British forces. There were 29,000 French soldiers and sailors involved at the Battle of Yorktown. About 9,000 or slightly under 10,000 American soldiers and militia. And the French helped us win our independence from the British. And the French bankrupted themselves, helping us. And why did they do that? Because they viewed Britain as a mortal enemy. Britain and France were the 2 strongest countries on the face of the earth. Almost 10,000 American soldiers, regular soldiers and militia would die in that war. It's a tremendous number. Actually, I'm wrong, 20,000. About 10,000 of them died on prisoner ships. The British had these huge ships where they put prisoners, and basically they died of dysentery. They died of, they were eating rancid meat. All kinds of illnesses spread very, very quickly. So they were horribly maltreated, and they died on those ships. So significant losses, 20,000 dead. We had about 2.5 million people in the colonies then, give or take. And also a footnote that's interesting is some of the Southerners said, why are we in this revolution? I mean, this is Boston's problem when it started, right? They said that's their problem, the Stamp Act, the tea and all the rest. They were making money, particularly in Georgia and South Carolina, selling American cotton to the British. And even right up to the end of the war, in the case of Georgia and South Carolina, about half of the population supported the British side, and a significant number fought for the British against their fellow Americans. And so that makes, when you think about it, the Declaration of Independence in 1776 so remarkable, because among those who signed it were the delegates from Georgia and South Carolina. So the war actually begins before 1776 in Boston. Obviously, Philadelphia becomes a hub for the battle. It's the Philadelphia State Assembly, where the Pennsylvania State Assembly in Philadelphia, where the Declaration of Independence is signed. It's also where 8.5 years later, they debated the Constitution. Eventually, that was accepted, ratified by the states, and so forth and so on. So very, very important, and none of it would have been possible without the great George Washington. And George Washington, at the Constitutional Convention, he had some hesitancy to be there, but he was strongly encouraged to go, so he went. Keep something in mind. If the Americans had lost, and they could have lost very, very easily, especially without the help of the French, every one of these men would have been tortured and hanged, starting with George Washington. George Washington was trained in many ways as a British soldier, as the regular army, many of these senior officers were. And so they knew their tactics and so forth. But that said, George Washington was a tremendous soldier. He was a tremendous president. He was a fantastic unifying force. When he ran for president twice, there was no opponent. He received all the Electoral College votes, and he could have claimed that he was the emperor. He could have claimed some form of dictatorship, if you will, and he refused. And so he had the capacity to exercise this enormous power and basically take over the country. And it really never crossed his mind. It never crossed his mind. That is a fantastic man, regardless of what people try to turn him into and say about him.
For all this and much more, sign up for Levin TV.